Hello, ladies and gentlemen, everybody. I am happy to participate in this important conference. The title of our session is Planning Urban Spaces, Transitional and Local Histories. The field of urban planning was among the important fields that the British Mandate authorities developed and invested great efforts in order to promote in mandatory Palestine. Well-known British planners worked in mandatory Palestine, among them Maclean, Ashby, Holiday, Gates, and Kendall. I am sure that we will hear more about all of them. They designed master plans for several cities, such as Jerusalem, Haifa, and Jaffa, and even small cities or towns such as Tiberias, Safed, Nablus, and more. In general, it can be said that almost all the cities in mandatory Palestine have undergone major changes, and their built space has expanded significantly. Not all the residents or parties were satisfied with the results, but undoubtedly the cities developed and underwent fundamental changes. With us today, three experts who have studied the subject. I am sure that they will contribute to our knowledge on the subject and shed a new light on it. I have the honor to invite the first speaker, Dr. Shira Wolkoff. Shira is a historian from the Faculty of Architecture and Town Planning in the Technion. She teaches modern history of the landscape, urban planning, and environment. The title of her lecture is Writing Colonial Urbanism, Architecture versus Urban Planners, and the Imperial Ideas of Partition. Shira, go ahead.
So thank you very much, Billy and Liat, for inviting me and for putting together this great conference. It's a special treat. And I'm happy to open the session on urbanism and spatiality, and I'm especially happy to open it because I'm a specialized historian. I am a what we call professional. I'm a historian of professionals of the built environment professions, architecture, urban planning, landscape architecture. But I was also trained, and my larger questions lie within the so-called general history of this group. And one of my, I would say, bigger research and scholarly projects is to connect the two communities. The so-called, I would say, like C.P. Snow's two cultures. These two communities are run in parallel and hardly find meaningful bridges. And what I'm really trying to do is to create meaningful interventions, mutual interventions, which between these two disciplines. So let's see if I make it today. So I'll present one of these kind of ways that I'm trying to do this. Okay. Over the past 3 decades, colonial architecture and urbanism has been one of the most dynamic subfields of urban and architectural history. Taking its cue from post-colonial theories, the discovery of the colonial space in the late 1980s ushered in a profound shift in architectural history from Eurocentric analyses of form and progression of styles to a wider consideration of architecture as inherently embedded within larger political and social forces. Scholars turned to former colonial territories, asking how European rule shaped these environments and societies by using architecture and urbanism to wield political and economic authority over these spaces. Anthony King's 1984 seminal work on the India-originated bungalow was followed by a surge of illustrative case studies spanning from North Africa to Southeast Asia and the Caribbean, tying together diverse colonial experiences, mostly British and French, but also addressing Dutch, Italian, German, and Portuguese colonialism, revealing recurring urban morphologies and policies related to white power and social engineering. Scholars also extended their scope to the metropoles, imperial hubs, showing the direct impact of colonial exploitation on their urban form. Indeed, the shift towards colonialism, as Kathleen James Chakraborty argues, quote, has changed how the architecture of almost all parts of the world is understood, end quote. By the early 2000s, however, as the buzz around the new post-colonial theories gradually waned, the initial binaries of colonized versus colonizers and the so-called West versus the rest gave way to a more nuanced understanding of the multiplicity of stakeholders engaged in the making of colonial and post-colonial space. These locales are now explored as a complex array of transnational circuits and multiple local and foreign actors and ambitions intersecting across different scales. As a result, we now know more about colonial officers, technocrats, entrepreneurs, merchant and missionary networks, and especially about indigenous agency, as a growing body of work focuses on themes ranging from resistance among marginalized indigenous communities to alliances forged by local elites with colonial agencies. Even though spatial experts, architects and planners, have always been a salient part of, well, building colonial landscapes, one crucial aspect remains surprisingly unpacked. Thus, all too often, we clump together architecture and planning, treating this coupling as a unified umbrella term for the making of colonial space. Rarely do we think of the distinct contribution made by each of these closely related yet separate domains. I argue today that a more nuanced consideration of the different kinds of knowledge each of these professions brings to the colonial city-making reveals important insights, especially regarding unexplored continuities that have extended into post-independence. So what are these fields? By urban planning, I refer to policy-oriented expertise that emerged in the context of the fin de siècle industrial city and expanded by the mid-20th century to include metropolitan, regional, and national concerns. Unlike architecture's focus on design, form, the architectural object, and the scale of the single project, planning engages with large-scale questions like rural-urban relations, metropolitan coordination, land use allocation, and integration between the physical, economic, and social dimensions. Urban and architectural historiography, however, tends to collapse these professional considerations under the single banner of architecture. The subordination of planning to architecture is especially evident in interwar architectural history. In a time of intense experimentation with new spatial forms and social ordering, with insights flowing from the social sciences, its urban and architectural history is chiefly considered through the lens of architectural modernism, whereby the Bauhaus and the international style and Corbusier became the icon for an entire period. So while SIAM, the International Congress of Modern Architecture, which is the professional organization of modernists, architectural modernists, led by Corbusier and others, has been the focus of scholarship. In fact, the International Federation of Housing and Planning, the IFHP, was the most influential arena for exchange of urban and planning ideas. It was an offshoot, its successor of the Garden City movement, and its planning conferences in the 1920s and 1930s attracted thousands of delegates from tens of countries worldwide, bringing together administrators, urbanists, and others seeking solutions to global issues of rapid urbanization, expansion of the built-up areas, and increasing population. However, this rich professional context, populated by planning-minded experts, has remained largely under the scholarly radar. So crucially, large-scale thinking characterized the emergent idea of planning. And this is why Zionist planners in Palestine were attracted to the imperial idea of partition. Planners, not architects. Even though Palestine was a mandatory territory and not a full-fledged colony, that it was part of the British imperial system, and we heard from Mustafa a wonderful description, meant that the major spatial transformation it underwent over The short 3 decades of British rule drew directly from the norms, practices, and design techniques that traveled from the colonies. These spatial realities, however, were also complicated by the presence of the Zionist settler colonial movement, who pushed for territorial expansion at the cost of the dispossession of the indigenous population, and were a major developmental agent in Palestine. Against this background, what we will do today is demonstrate how the political idea of partition was crucial to the work of Zionist planners in transitioning from the colonial to the post-independence era. I will demonstrate how an obscure proto-national plan for Jewish mass settlement, triggered by the publication of the Peel Partition Plan, challenges us to revise a received narrative on post-independence nation building, whereas the 1948 mass settlement endeavor is usually understood through the lens of heroic architectural modernism rooted in interwar Central European avant-garde, I will situate its roots within the messy realities of the imperial politics of partition and the work of obscure planners. So let's begin, and to do so, we'll start from the end. So, between 1948 and 51, 15 new towns, Arim Chadashot, Ayarot Pituach later as they were called, were built across the country, profoundly shaping Israeli landscape and society. The story of this Israeli tour de force, the Sharon Plan, is typically rehearsed through architectural modernism, where the project embodied a successful marriage of post-war nation building with the social values of avant-garde design modernism. It is especially associated with the renowned architect Aryeh Sharon, who was a Bauhaus School graduate, and it is also understood as such by critical scholars like Oren Iftachel, Sharon Rothbard, Smadar Sharon, and others. But this, I argue, misses the bigger picture, because if we focus on planning, we reveal a much darker story. Zionist planners responded to the imperial idea of partition of aligning political borders to national communities by employing large-scale planning tools to support a settler's minority's imagination of a land emptied of its Arab majority. In these macro processes, the agency of certain individuals was crucial. Eliezer Brutzkus emerges as a main protagonist. Born in St. Petersburg in 1907, Brutzkus studied civil engineering at the Technische Hochschule Berlin-Charlottenburg and emigrated to Palestine in 1933 following the Nazi rise to power. By 1939, he held the position of the chief municipal planner of Bnei Brak, a burgeoning suburb near Tel Aviv. In parallel, he also began publishing on questions of large-scale planning and the urban future of Palestine Jewry. His persona embodied the period's classic planning advocate, as we have learned from Anthony Sutcliffe. Brutzkus developed an idiosyncratic urban theory blending the interwar discourse on planned metropolitan decentralization that he learned from the International Federation of Housing and Planning, German locational theories, albeit not that of Kristaller, and I'll be happy to talk about it later, and Zionist debates over market liberalism. He argued for planned decentralization of Zionist settlement in the form of a network of small and medium-sized towns. Each town would serve as a market town for its surrounding agricultural hinterland, thereby creating a regional semi-autonomous unit. Ultimately, the Zionist landscape would be comprised of a chain of these regional units. Now, it's crucial to understand that his urban large-scale vision was at odds with the dominant rural pioneering ethos of the Zionist movement, which envisioned an agrarian society and considered the city ideologically inferior. Further, the Zionist leaders espoused a strategy of incremental expansion, keeping any large ambitions deliberately vague. Brutzkus's first opportunity to translate his ideas into concrete plan came in 1937 with the publication of the Peel Partition Plan. The idea of partition as an answer to ethnic conflict, which emerged for the first time out of the debates of ethnicity, nationhood, and citizenship during and immediately after the Great War. The 1923 Turkey-Greece population exchange, resulting from the Lausanne Treaty, set the model for creating a new interwar toolbox for nation building, including population transfer, mass deportation, forcible denationalization, and partition. The British imperial world was the birthplace of the idea of partition that was later implemented in Germany, Korea, and Vietnam. Following the apparent success of the Irish partition in the early 1920s, the notion of partition entered into imperial politics, first in Palestine in 1937, albeit implemented only partially a decade later, and in India. It is important to remember that partition, as Aryeh Dubnov and Laura Robson argue, and I quote them, belonged firmly within the imperial realm. It was less a vehicle for national liberation than a novel, sophisticated divide-and-conquer tactic that sought to co-opt the new global tilt toward the ethnic nation-state, end quote. In Palestine, the eruption of the Arab Revolt in 1936 and the intercommunal violence that swept the country led to the publication of the Peel Partition Plan in July 1937. It proposed dividing Palestine into separate homogeneous Jewish and Arab states based on population exchange. As scholars emphasized, the plan marked a turning point in Zionist political thought. Although the principle of territorial partition has already broached within Zionist circles after that 1929 outbreak of the Jewish-Arab violence, and I learned that from Moti's great article, and I'm happy he's here today. The Peel Partition Plan constituted a watershed moment. For the first time, the possibility of a separate Jewish statehood was publicly spelled out, resting on a potential mass transfer of Palestinians. Whether and how the explicit linkage between Jewish statehood and the removal of the Palestinian informed the 1948 events and the expulsion of Palestinians has received much heated debates over several decades. Yet, whereas the bulk of scholarship focuses on the political and intellectual spheres, examining the debates and ideas that ensued from the Peel Partition Plan, here we can see how the idea of linking political borders to homogeneous national groups generated responses from another community, the techno-scientific one, the planners, a response that had crucial consequences for the 1948 moment. According to the plan, the Jewish state would cover about 1/5 of the area of Palestine, consisting mainly of the urbanized coastline and the northern valleys. The Palestinian state would extend over the rest of the territory in addition to a small internationalized zone that would secure imperial interest and the holy sites. This was the first time that the idea of an exclusively Jewish state was officially on the table. This when Palestine Jewry was still a minority, comprising no more than 25–26% of the entire population of Palestine. Brutzkus reacted to this new political horizon of an all-Jewish state by devising a national land use plan for its proposed boundaries. Since the Palestinians constituted nearly 50% of the population and owned 80% of the land in the designated Jewish state, the Peel Partition Plan proposed a population exchange which entailed the removal of some 225,000 Arabs located within the future Jewish state, as opposed to a mere 1,250 Jews living within the future Arab state in Gush Etzion. While this idea appeared in a very general and rudimentary form, it was just enough to enable Brutzkus to envision for the first time an all-Jewish entity and to conceive of its future through large-scale planning. Based on his previous ideas, he proposed a national physical plan based on a chain of small and medium-sized garden cities to be built along the Mediterranean coast in the gaps between the already existing Jewish localities. Each town would be connected to the farmlands lying to the east, each serving as a market town, while the entire country would be divided on the basis of key land uses within a national comprehensive plan. For the remainder of the mandate period, he relentlessly advocated his idea, and you can see here one of his Now you can see one of his attempts communicating his ideas in professional journals. I translated this from Hebrew. For the remainder of the Mandate period, he relentlessly advocated his idea of national planning, though with a limited degree of success, not least due both to the rural ethos that still loomed large within Palestine Jewry and the outbreak of the World War. But the conditions changed in 1948. The 1948 war, the Nakba, resulted in a tragic outcome for the Palestinians. Some 750,000 Palestinians were displaced from their homes, becoming refugees, and the lands that they left behind were nationalized. In parallel, about the same number of Jewish immigrants from war-torn Europe and the Middle East flooded into the country within the first 3.5 years of statehood. In July 1948, the National Planning Department, Israel's newly established Supreme Planning Bureau, was established. Ariel Sharon, the famous Bauhaus graduate, became its head, and he appointed Brutzkus as a senior planner. The planning department was charged with creating housing solutions for the massive wave of immigrants while cementing the Jewish presence on former Palestinian land. Although Brutzkus and his colleagues did not necessarily anticipate the violent unfolding of 1948 events and the mass removal of the Palestinians, his pre-1948 imagination, his Peel partition imagination, already envisioned the possibility of the absence of Palestinians as a precondition for national-scale planning. Ample archival documentation reveals how Brutzkus quickly updated his pre-1948 plan to meet the new territorial and demographic realities. The result was that the rationale of the so-called Sharon Plan drew directly on the idea of a chain of Jewish-only semi-autonomous regions proposed by Brutzkus in the 1930s. As early as May 1948, the country was already divided into 24 administrative regions. Each region was to include a plugged-in regional market town, now called a new town. The chief planning document of this plan is the 1951 publication, Tochnit Av Lefizour Ochlusiya. The authorial voice of the key parts is unmistakably that of Brutzkus, in some places using the same wording and statistical charts that appeared in his writings from the late 1930s. In the months that followed, a division of labor would emerge between the modernist architects in the planning department, led by Sharon, who focused on mass housing, the neighborhood unit, and the urban scale layout. So a division of labor would emerge between this kind of architectural and spatial production and that of the planners, who focused on the overall rationale of land use, settlement structure, population dispersal, and the systematic erasure of the Palestinian layer. And as these images became the plan's glaring symbol, its underlying principles were rooted in pre-1948 Jewish large-scale sectorial imaginations, the tools for which were in the hands of urban planners, and the imperial principle of partition as its trigger. To sum up, foregrounding planning enables us to expose the so-called messy realities resulting from a settler colonial society and tap into the longer history of Zionist colonization, dispossession, and violence. Through the work of planners, we can establish a direct link between the watershed moment of 1938, the partition moment, and the post-1948 Sharon Plan, the development towns. This link departs from the standard narrative of Sharon Plan's heroic modernism, revealing instead how its roots are entangled within the imperial politics of interwar period and the realities of Zionist colonization. And more broadly, it is a reminder of the unexpected ways by which colonialism and empire remain etched on the landscapes of societies throughout the former colonized world. Thank you.